Yeah, great. So thanks Judith, and thank you as well to Danny for inviting me to present at this meeting. So today I'll be presenting about my past and future planned work on sleep and mood disorders. Um, so my talk's going to cover the following areas. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about sleep and mood disorders and how they're related, and then speak specifically about my previous work where I focus specifically on bipolar disorder. I'm then going to talk about how I'm going to take this work forward in my fellowship, and then finally briefly talk about some public engagement I've been doing in this area and how I plan to take it forward in the future. So first, when I use the term mood disorders, I'm primarily in this talk referring to major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. So very briefly, major depressive disorder is characterized by episodes of low mood, termed depression, and bipolar disorder is characterized primarily based on the presence of episodes of high mood, termed mania. However, episodes of depression can also occur. So sleep disturbances are common in both of these disorders and actually form part of the diagnostic criteria for mood episodes. So in depression, we have insomnia and hypersomnia listed as symptoms in DSM and ICD criteria. And in mania, there's reduced need for sleep, and that's also a symptom. And this is where people experience where they can only sleep for, say, 4 hours a night and still feel rested. However, there's increasing evidence that sleep problems are more than just a symptom of mood disorders. So first, studies have shown that sleep disturbances can persist outside of mood episodes. So for example, a person who experiences insomnia during a depressive episode can also then have it so that the insomnia continues even though the depressive episode has been treated. Longitudinal studies then have also found that people with insomnia are at an increased risk of experiencing depression in the future, suggesting that it could be a potential risk marker for mood disorders. So third, then, sleep loss is also one of the most commonly reported early warning signs of mood episodes in people with bipolar disorder. And finally, we now have lots of accumulating evidence from RCTs showing that improving sleep could lead to improvements in mood and longer-term outcomes in people with mood disorders. However, there are still some knowledge gaps, and one of these is, as Danny mentioned earlier, that the relationship between sleep and mood is bidirectional. So we have a chicken and egg problem when trying to determine what comes first. And as I just mentioned, sleep disturbances are a symptom themselves of mood disorders, so you can see how this can be a very complex relationship to try to disentangle. And then also what a lot of my research has focused on is the fact that there's also evidence that there are individual differences in the sleep-mood relationship. So just to take an example from one type of research, so when we look at sleep deprivation therapy studies, where this has been used to treat depressive episodes, when sleep deprivation therapy has been used in people with bipolar disorder, we find that some people, the treatment's effective and their mood becomes euthymic, but other people become more depressed and some people even become manic. So closing these knowledge gaps will help us understand our knowledge of what the causes and factors are in mood disorders, and also inform future treatments. So my past research has and up to date actually has primarily focused on the role of sleep in bipolar disorder. So for this research, I've conducted analyses on data from the Bipolar Disorder Research Network, and this is an ongoing research programme which aims to identify the environmental and genetic determinants of bipolar disorders. So to date, roughly 6,000 people are enrolled in the BDRN who've been recruited from across the UK, primarily through NHS services and patient support organisations such as Bipolar UK. So once enrolled, participants' diagnoses are confirmed using a psychiatric interview, and this information from this is combined with case notes to arrive at a research diagnosis. Then during the interview that participants take part in, they're also asked other questions about their illness, and a DNA sample is taken. So during my PhD, part of my work examined data from 3,140 BGRN participants who'd been asked about whether they'd noticed anything that had triggered their episodes of high or low mood. And they were asked about a number of different things, one of which was sleep loss, but also physical illness, alcohol, non-prescription drugs, and medication. And when we examined these triggers, we found that sleep loss was the most commonly reported trigger of manic and depressive episodes, with 20% of people reporting that it had triggered their episodes of high mood, and 11% reporting that it had triggered episodes of depression. So going back to thinking about individual differences here in the sleep-mood relationship, what I wanted to do is look to see if we found differences when we looked at, when we compared people based on gender and bipolar disorder subtype. So very briefly, here we are comparing people with bipolar type 1 to those with bipolar type 2. And people with bipolar type 1 have the more severe manic episodes, which can include psychosis or require hospitalization, whereas people with bipolar type 2 disorder, they have less severe forms of mania, but are in general more likely to experience episodes of depression. So when we looked at these individual differences, we found that women and people with bipolar type 1 were more likely to report that sleep loss had triggered their episodes of high mood. We also found that women were more likely to report that sleep loss had triggered episodes of depression, and likewise for people with bipolar type 2, but we didn't find significant differences there, or that those relationships didn't persist when we controlled for confounders. So then in a separate study, we examined data from 870 women in BGRN who had given birth, and found that those who had reported that sleep loss had triggered episodes of mania were more likely to experience episodes of postpartum psychosis. So this is a term for episodes of mania or psychosis or mixed episodes that can occur after childbirth. So these results helped us understand what individual differences might be implicated in the sleep-mood relationship, and also suggested that sensitivity to sleep loss could be an important thing to ask women about if they have got bipolar disorder and are pregnant. So, however, studies here were limited to retrospective data, and it highlighted the need for us to do prospective studies to confirm these findings. So the other focus of my research has been on the role of genetics in the association between sleep and mood. So in this research, I've used genetic risk scores. So these are derived by taking the results from genome-wide association studies, where, for example, the DNA of people with insomnia is compared to the DNA of people who don't have insomnia. And then those studies then identify genetic variants, or otherwise called single nucleotide polymorphisms, that are associated with that trait of interest. So, for example, insomnia. So then polygenic risk scores, or genetic risk scores, are derived by, in each participant, looking at their DNA and looking at how many of those genetic variants that have previously been implicated that they have, and then creating a genetic risk score that's weighted by the effect sizes of those genetic variants that were identified in the genome-wide association studies. So we did this in BGRN. We looked at the genetic data of 4,672 people with bipolar disorder in BGRN. So they either had bipolar disorder type 1 or type 2, and compared their data to people, to healthy controls. So it was 5,714 healthy controls. And when we calculated these genetic risk scores for sleep duration, insomnia, daytime sleepiness, and chronotype, we found that people with bipolar disorder had greater genetic risk scores for longer sleep duration, daytime sleepiness, and eveningness chronotype compared to the healthy controls. However, the main focus of this study was to look at differences between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, given our previous work in this area and other people's work as well. So when we did that in our sample, we compared each of these subgroups to each other and to the healthy controls, and we found that people with bipolar 1 had greater genetic risk scores for longer sleep duration, whereas those with bipolar type 2 had greater genetic risk scores for insomnia. So this study suggested that there are differences in the way that some sleep-associated genetic factors are associated with bipolar disorder subtypes. But we weren't able to examine whether genetic risk for sleep traits was associated with sleep phenotypes in this sample because we didn't have data on sleep available. In addition, whereas sleep disturbances and mood disorders often emerge in adolescence, as Danny pointed out earlier, most sleep GWAS have been conducted in middle-aged adults. And so this highlighted as well the need to test whether the same genetic factors influence sleep in younger populations. So I'm planning to take this work forward and broaden my skills in the area of sleep and mood disorders in my fellowship. So the Sir Henry Wellcome Postdoctoral Fellowship is an early career fellowship that lasts for 4 years. And the aim is to get training, visit different research locations, which is a little bit difficult right now, and start to establish independence. So the first aim of my fellowship is going to address one of the limitations from my previous work, which has primarily relied on self-reported sleep phenotypes, or in fact no data on sleep phenotypes at all. And I'll be working with Dr. Sean Purcell at Harvard Medical School to determine whether genetic risk scores for sleep phenotypes and mood disorders are associated with sleep neurophysiology as measured using EEG. And here I'm going to receive training in new methods for analysing EEG data that Sean has developed in his lab. So then the second aim, I'm going to be working with Professor Mick O'Donovan and Professor Francis Rice at Cardiff University in the MRC Centre. And so in my previous work, I wasn't able to examine whether genetic variants for sleep phenotypes index sleep disturbance in adolescents. So as most sleep GWAS have been conducted in older adults. So therefore in this aim, I'm going to be examining whether genetic risk scores for sleep traits are associated with sleep phenotypes in adolescents and determine what role genetics plays in this longitudinal association we see between sleep and depression in young people. So there I'm going to be gaining more skills working with longitudinal data. So then finally, for my third aim, I'm going to be working with Dr. John Heron and Dr. Kate Saunders at the University of Bristol and University of Oxford. And here I'm going to be examining the association between sleep and mood episodes using intensive longitudinal data. So intensive longitudinal data, sometimes you might see it referred to as EMA or ecological momentary assessment data, but this is essentially longitudinal data that's intense, as the name suggests, in that you typically have over 20 measurements per person. So that data that you'd get from actigraphs or fitness trackers and things like that would come under this umbrella term. So yeah, during this, I'm going to be using a number of data sets, one of which is going to be data from the BGRN participants. So people in BGRN have been invited to measure their mood using an online mood monitoring tool called True Colours. So far, over 1,000 people in the sample are currently using this, and on average have about a year's worth of data, but it's always continuing. And so the fact that we have this more complex data allows us to better disentangle this bi-directional relationship between sleep and mood. And I'm going to be doing that using new statistical methods that have been developed for use in intensive longitudinal data, specifically dynamic structural equation modelling. So, and the other thing about these new statistical techniques is that they also allow us to look at what individual differences are associated with differences between people in the strength of the relationship between sleep and mood. And they also allow me to derive novel measures of mood and sleep variability. So that's what I'm currently working on at the moment. So finally, as part of my fellowship, I am eligible to apply for research enrichment funding for public engagement. And the aims of this funding are to build trust between the public and research, for researchers to discover how public insights can help progress and develop their research, and finally for researchers to develop their skills in public engagement. So far, most of my public engagement work has been with adults, but I have started to do more public engagement activities with young people as well. So examples included working with the Scouts to do a session on sleep for one of the badges, and also presenting at the Wales Gene Park Sixth Form Conference as well. At the moment, I'm currently working with the Welsh network of healthy school schemes, Cwm Taf Morgannwg team. So they deliver the scheme to approximately 200 schools in the South Wales valleys. And at the moment, I'm working with them to develop webinars for teachers on sleep, but those are more focused on adult sleep. So the aim in the future is that they would like to develop resources for children's sleep, young or adolescent sleep to be used in schools. And I was thinking that this would form part of my application for this funding. The other limitation so far of the work I've done is that it's primarily been one-way public engagement. So, for example, giving a talk. And so I'd really like to explore more novel ways to do engagement using two-way engagement, for instance. So if anyone in SCRAMS or here today would like to offer any advice or collaborate, it'd be very welcome, especially the expertise that you all have in this area. So thank you again for inviting me to speak, and I'd just like to thank the BGRN participants, everyone in the BGRN team, as well as my sponsors and collaborators for my fellowship, including my primary sponsor, Professor Mick O'Donovan, and my fellowship mentor, Alice Gregory.